Hello everyone and welcome back to the Supercoach EPL channel. In this video, I'll take a look at some of the best midfielders and forwards to start the Supercoach EPL season. In my last video, I checked out some of the best goalkeeper and defender options, so I'll use similar stats and tables to help find the best value picks in these positions as well. I was also part of a 2-hour live stream yesterday on the SDS Supercoach channel, just going through a variety of Supercoach EPL questions with some legends of the Supercoach community, in SDS Supercoach himself, of course, the Skodfather, Scobie, and Supercoach Whisperer. So please do check that out if you haven't already. We answer a lot of questions that you may have, and we would really appreciate if you do check that out. With that being said, let's get started with the video. Okay, so for those of you who saw my video last week on the best goalkeepers and defenders for Supercoach EPL, you'll have seen some tables similar to this where I looked at the stats for each player from last season and converted them to an expected Supercoach points, just to give us an idea of what we can expect these players to be scoring per game. So I did the same thing for the midfielders here, and the stats that I chose to focus on are goals, assists, shots on target, key passes, crosses, CBITs, and whether they're a pen taker or not. Now, CBIT stands for clearances, blocks, interceptions, and tackles, which if you have a look underneath me here, you can see that each of those metrics are given a small number of points by Supercoach. So even though these are midfielders and forwards that we're going to be looking at, CBITs will still add up over the course of a game, and it does still add to the expected Supercoach points that we can expect a player to score. So you can see that right at the top, we've got Palmer, Bruno Fernandes, Foden, Eze, Wilson, Ahmad, and Bowen. Now, something to keep in mind here, especially with Foden and Wilson, is if you look at their appearances, you can see that in the brackets, they've got quite a few number of substitute appearances, which does inflate their stats, because these stats do assume that these players are playing a full 90 minutes. So you always have to take that into consideration, because some players just don't play every game, just because some players just don't start every game. So you always want to try and pick the players that are going to be playing as many minutes as possible. So if we focus on the players that do play a lot of minutes, you can see that all the highest priced players are generally the ones that will score the most expected Supercoach points. So you might be thinking, how do we know which expensive play to go for and which ones to pass? So the important thing with Supercoach is we have to remember that captaincy plays a huge role in the game, and you always want to have some high scoring players in your team to allow you to switch between captaincy and lock in a good score, given that it's such an important part of the game. So with that in mind, it almost draws me into players like Palmer, Fernandes, and Eze, because you can always guarantee that they're going to score at least 10 points a game, if not more. And if you also have a look at the second last column here, you can see that they are the penalty takers for their team, which does mean that they don't necessarily have to have the best game for them to just get a cheap penalty and still be scoring and get a lot of points for your team. Now, one correction I do want to make, when I did make this graphic, I did think that Eze was still the first choice penalty taker for Crystal Palace. Since then, Crystal Palace has played Liverpool in the Community Shield final, where Mateta did take the penalty over Eze, and even in the penalty shootout, Mateta did score his penalty, whereas Eze missed. So I would like to update that now and just say that I don't think Eze is the first choice penalty taker, but he could still be possibly taking penalties if Mateta isn't on the pitch, or if they just decide to share it for any reason. Now, the expensive players are obviously going to be good, that goes without saying, but if we try and have a look at some of the more value options in the game, Harry Wilson for Fulham here also stands out because he's priced at a pretty reasonable 6.8 million, but he's up there with the big boys in terms of his expected Supercoach points per game. Now, as I said before, he has had a lot of substitute appearances last season, but that was also because he was coming back from a few injuries and his spot in the team wasn't quite guaranteed. He's had a really good start to preseason. He scored quite a few goals, being Fulham's highest goal scorer for preseason, I believe. So he's in some good form. If you think that he can carry that on to start the season, I think he's a great pick at that price. Going down a bit further, one of the cheapest names on this list that really stands out for me is Adingra for Sunderland. Now, Adingra has just joined Sunderland from Brighton this off-season, and he had a lot of substitute appearances again for Brighton last year. At Sunderland, I do expect him to be a full-time starter, so his appearances should look a lot different. And if you look at his stats, even though they are slightly inflated due to his substitute appearances last season, he's still right up there in terms of expected goals and expected assists per game. So you can see here that he's expected to contribute 0.45 goals and assists per game, which basically means that he's going to give you a goal or assist return 1 in every 2 games. So I think that's a great return for someone at his price point, and he's basically locked in my team as a result. Now, I'm not expecting him to keep that same level of performance for arguably weaker Sunderland team. But even if he performs at, half or 75% of that output, I think he would still be a good pick at that price. And he's only going to increase in value, allowing you to potentially move him on to a better option when he maxes out in price. Another thing to note is that Sunderland do have some of the easiest fixtures to start the season. So another reason to start with him. And you'd rather save that trade on needing to bring him in by just starting him in the first place. Now, the names lower down on this list, you can see that they're not really standing out in any of the attacking metrics of the game, but a lot of them are highlighted for CBITs per game. Again, CBIT standing for clearances, blocks, interceptions, and tackles per game. So you can see 4 of the highlighted players at the bottom being Baleba, Idris Agay, Caicedo, and Bissouma, all doing very well in those defensive metrics and still providing a reasonable output for their price. Okay, so moving on to the forwards now, you can see that it's basically the exact same table here, but just replacing the midfielders with the forwards now and their stats. So looking at this table here, the standout player for me is surprisingly not actually Mo Salah, but Bukayo Saka from Arsenal right at the top here. He's priced 5 million cheaper than Mo Salah, which is quite a bit of money. And based on the stats from last season only, he is expected to get a higher expected Supercoach points per game. This is basically due to his dominance in all the other smaller metrics, which are all adding up to give him a higher potential output than Salah. You can see that the expected goals and expected assists from last season are in fact exactly the same. Saka is averaging a higher rate of key passes per 90, crosses per 90, and double CBITs per 90, which is all equaling to a higher output. Having said that, Saka did take the penalties for Arsenal last season, whereas this season they have signed a new striker in Gyökeres, who has a very good penalty record and is rumoured to potentially be taking over the penalty reins at Arsenal. So that will potentially reduce Saka's output because he will get less goals throughout the season, whereas Salah should remain the main penalty taker at Liverpool. But having said that, if you just look at their price and their expected output, Saka seems like an almost no-brainer compared to Salah. Even though you can see that his appearances are considerably lower than Salah's, that is because he did get an injury, so that's not really something you can predict going into the season. So as long as they both have a full, healthy season, I think Saka will be better value for money. Having said that, Salah is priced as he is for a reason. He scored the most points in the whole game last year, and I expect him to probably be right at the top again. And it's always easy to start the season with someone like him and trade him out and be able to afford literally anyone in the game, then start the season without him and have to trade a lot of players to be able to afford him if you do end up wanting him later on. Now, looking below those two, we have another 2 big names in Haaland and Isak, both world-class strikers in their own right. Both have incredible stats from last year. The only thing with Isak, of course, is that he currently isn't involved in any activities at Newcastle as he's requested a move away from the club. Newcastle are holding out for a fee that they believe he's worth, so unless he gets transferred to a new club in the Premier League or he makes up with Newcastle, I definitely wouldn't start the season with him. Haaland, I think, is a great pick to start the season. I think he had a bit of a down season last year, if you could call it a down season. But by his own standards, I think it was a bit of a down year. I think Man City has improved a lot as a team overall this offseason. I think they've got a lot of better players around him. And I think as long as the team starts well, I think they're all going to be feeding him because he's the main target of the team. All the goals are going to be funneled through him compared to someone like Salah at Liverpool, where I can see him having a much smaller goal share of all of Liverpool's goals compared to Haaland. I think Haaland will get most of Man City's goals, whereas I can see other players at Liverpool like Wirtz, Ekitike, Cody Gakpo, Isak, if he goes there, I can see other players chipping in with the goals. Now, if we look past the 4 big boys at the top here, we've got a few cheaper players in Sarr, Gakpo, Marmoush, and Watkins. All 4 of these performed pretty well last year for their own right, and you can see that they do stand out in quite a few different metrics, with Sarr and Gakpo having some of the highest expected assists per game, and Watkins and Marmoush having some of the highest expected goals per game. If you combine both of those, all 4 of these players do rank as the next best set of players that you could possibly pick just below the highest priced players at the top. You can also see, based on the expected Supercoach points per game, that it's not that much lower than the players above them, and they do stand out in some extra metrics such as, CBIT and key passes per game, which is really boosting their score up. So given all of that, and given that Supercoach does value these other sides of the game, it really does tempt me to pick at least 1, if not 2 of these cheaper options, just to see how much value I can get out of my team, because I can see these players' price going up if I think that their team's going to perform well, and I also think that they're underpriced based on the output that they can give. I also just want you guys to have a look at which of these players are expected to take the penalties for their team going into the season, because although penalties are not guaranteed in any game, it's just another avenue to points that your player may have, because like I said before, they don't necessarily have to perform the best in the game just for their team to be awarded a penalty and your player gets some free points basically. So if I'm ever 50-50 between a couple of players, for example, I try and see which one of those players might be on penalties maybe, because that may sway my decision. Can expect a Premier League team to get a penalty roughly 5 times a season. Now, obviously that is a very arbitrary number because some teams may get more, some may get less. But let's just say on average, a team does get a few over the course of the season. If your player is taking those penalties, that will still add up to quite a few points over the course of the season. Now, a few other players I just wanted to point out before we moved on from this table here are Evan Nilsson from Bournemouth, right in the middle there. He's priced at a pretty cheap 6.5 million. Although I think Bournemouth has lost a few key pieces going into the season, I do think that their attack is still very strong. They haven't really lost anyone starting quality from their attack. I think Evan Nilsson's a very good striker who you can see in terms of expected goals per game is competing with some of the better strikers in the game, but he's just lacking in some of the other metrics, which is bringing him down. But for his price, I think that if he can sustain his expected goals per game whilst improving some of the other metrics, I think he can be a good starting pick for that price. Having said that though, you can get someone like Ekitike from Liverpool for basically the same price. So if you prefer a share of the Liverpool goals, then Ekitike might be your guy. But if you'd like to take a punt on a great player from a pretty good attacking team in Bournemouth, Evan Nilsson's not bad either. Just below Evan Nilsson, we've got Mateta there for Crystal Palace. He's been in great form in pre-season. He scored about 5 goals and he also scored in the Community Shield final. So he's been backing it up against a good opposition as well. I think Mateta's a great pick to start the season. The only thing with Crystal Palace is they do have some European games in between match week 1 and match week 2. And then in between match week 2 and match week 3. So basically, they are going to have 5 games over the first 3 Supercoach rounds, basically. So Mateta's minutes might not be as guaranteed as they would be at other points in the season. They also don't have the easiest fixtures to start the season with. So he might be one of those players that you consider bringing into your team instead of starting with. But I still think he will perform well regardless. And I do expect him to be one of the highest scoring forwards over the course of the season. Solanke as well, just before him, the starting striker for Spurs. He's currently been recovering from an injury. He hasn't really had a pre-season, but once he's fit and firing, I do expect him to have the starting spot for Tottenham up front. And I also do expect him to have penalties now that Son has left for LA. So that's another avenue to scoring for Solanke. But Tottenham have some decent creators behind him, and especially if they sign someone like Eze, then it does increase my appeal in Solanke because it's hard for him to not score with the amount of chances that they're going to create for him. Speaking of chances being created for them, I think João Pedro is going to feast when he's playing in this Chelsea team. All these stats that you're seeing on the screen here are from last season, playing for a worse Brighton team. And you can see in the few games that he's played for Chelsea, he's already got a great partnership with Cole Palmer and our other attacking players. He scored 5 goals in 5 games, averaging a goal every 50 minutes played. So he's in incredible form to start the season. The only question mark over him is that his starting spot is also under threat by another great striker in Liam Delap, who's not quite featured on this table here, but Chelsea have just signed him from Ipswich for 30 million and he's been given the number 9 shirt. He hasn't come in expecting to be a backup, but he probably will start as the backup to João Pedro, but I don't expect him to just sit on the bench for the whole game. He will come on. He'll probably come on around 60, 65 minutes, so it's just whether João Pedro can score enough points in the minutes that he's going to play, or if Liam Delap and Chelsea's almost unlimited attacking options, they're all going to impact João Pedro's minutes. So I'm probably going to skip on João Pedro to start the season. If he does get off to a flyer, it'll be hard to ignore him, but I think there's better value available, as you can see higher up on this table, or I'd just rather pick a player who I think is a more guaranteed starter and will play the whole game for the time being. Okay, so just like the end of my video last week where I discussed some of the highest owned goalkeepers and defenders, let's have a look at some of the highest owned midfielders first here. So we've got Cole Palmer here as the highest owned midfielder in the game at 54%. You can see his 3-week projected average here is over 12 points a game. So he's a very good captaincy shout and I can see why so many people are going with him to start the season. Rodri is the next highest picked player at 40%. Now, Rodri is incredibly cheap, mainly due to the injury that he had last year where he was almost out for the whole year, and therefore he's got an injury-affected price. So I can definitely understand why people are going with Rodri. However, the Man City manager has recently come out and said that Rodri won't be fit to start the season. He's expecting him to be fit perhaps towards the end of the first international break, which will be sometime towards October. So don't expect full 90 minutes from Rodri straight away. He might just have a few substitute appearances to start off with, or might not even play for the first few games of the season. If you want to stash him away on your bench just because you want to save a trade, fair enough. However, given that he's not really starting, I would possibly look at starting with a different player and then maybe moving to Rodri once he comes back fully fit. Now, Kobe Mainu as well is pretty highly owned at 27%. He's also very cheap, but he is going to be rotating with quite a few players for basically just one centre mid position in the United lineup, because Bruno Fernandes is a lock to play the other centre mid spot basically every game. So the one remaining spot will be rotated between the likes of Mainu, Casemiro, Ugarte, Mason Mount, probably just depending on opposition. So if he was a guaranteed starter, I think he would be a very good pick at that price. But given that he's going to be sharing his minutes with some other players, I'd probably avoid him for now and just see what his minutes look like. Lewis Skelly, I think, is a very good pick. We saw him in the midfielder stats table earlier. He actually plays as a left back for Arsenal, just filling in the midfield at times, but he's pretty attacking, and when he does play, he tends to be pretty involved in the build-up, and I can see him picking up quite a few defensive contribution points throughout the game. Again, his minutes are not guaranteed either, as is the case with most of these cheap midfielders here, because he does have Calafiori competing with him in the left back spot. Even Timber can play there if needed. So Arsenal do have a few options, but I do think Lewis Skelly is probably first choice, especially in the easier games. I just don't think he will play every single game going forward. So that's something to consider. Moving down, you can see Odegaard is a fair bit higher price than him at 4 million more, but Odegaard does give you the guarantee of minutes. He's the Arsenal captain, so he should start and play every single game. He had a bit of a down year last year, but with better players around him now and with a leading striker now in Gyökeres, I do expect Odegaard to have a better season than last year. And I think he's a pretty safe and reliable pick to start the season with, knowing what you're going to be getting from him. Then we've got Bruno, who is very expensive, but as we saw with the stats earlier, he does have the second highest potential for midfielders in the game. He offers a lot of attacking potential as well as defensive potential, especially now that he's moved further back in the team. It should allow him more opportunities to defend and pick up those small defensive points along the way. Now, Jack Grealish here is actually one of my favourite picks to start the game with, because as you can see here, he's just joined Everton. He was at Manchester City last year, where he didn't really play much, and when he did play, he wasn't playing many minutes. He was coming off the bench, or he was being substituted early. He wasn't really the main man there, but at Everton now, I do expect him to rediscover some of his Aston Villa form from a few years ago and make a mockery of that price point, really. So I think Jack Grealish is almost a lock in my team to start the season. Even if he doesn't play straight away from game week 1, I do think he'll come into the team pretty soon, and once he does come in, I think he'll start basically every game going forward. Now, scrolling a bit further down, we've got players like Caicedo, who, although I think he's a pretty safe pick given that he plays every single game and he will pick up points along the way, I do think he's slightly overpriced given that he doesn't really offer any attacking potential at all. Now, Dewsbury Hall, similar to Grealish before, he just joined Everton, this time from Chelsea. He's also coming in very cheap, and I think he's going to outperform his price given that he's going to be playing a much more prominent role in this Everton team now. He will be playing deeper than Grealish, so don't expect as many attacking returns. But alternatively, I do expect him to pick up more defensive points along the way. Okay, going further down, Adingra, like we mentioned before when we were looking at the midfielder data, Adingra is also one of my favorite picks to start the season. I think he's heavily underpriced given that he was playing mainly as a sub for Brighton last year, and now he's going to be playing as a starter for Sunderland. They also have some great fixtures to start the season, if you just have a look here. Go 25, 26. Okay, so they've got West Ham, Burnley, Brentford, Crystal Palace, Villa, Forest, United, and Wolves to start the season. So those are some pretty good fixtures to start the season with. Now, of course, he does play for Sunderland, who you could argue is the good fixture for most other teams, but when you're looking to pick an attacker, it doesn't really matter how many goals they might concede. You're just looking for someone who can offer some output at the other end, and Adingra definitely fits the bill for someone who I think can offer that. Now, Tijani Reinders, another interesting pick because he's been in some pretty good preseason form. He transferred over to Man City from AC Milan this summer, which is why he doesn't have any Premier League stats at the moment. However, he did average roughly 1 goal or assist in every 3 games in the Italian league last year, so he does have some attacking potential as well. So let's look at a few more players then before we move on to the forwards. Bowen, we can see he's not really that highly owned. He is pretty highly priced as well, so that would probably explain why. I do think Bowen is a pretty safe source of points because he is the main man at West Ham. Almost everything good that happens at West Ham does go through him. He's on the end of a lot of chances and he creates a lot of chances as well, which is why you can see that his projected 3-week average here is over 10 points a game. I do think he's fairly overpriced here to start the season. He can definitely perform at his price potential, but I do think you can probably pick him up cheaper at a later point in the season. Now, one last name before we move on from the midfielders here. Eberechi Eze is normally a name that I would be very interested in. However, he's currently in a lot of transfer rumours at the moment with Arsenal and especially Tottenham. Now, if he joins either of those teams, I do think he becomes a slightly worse asset because I don't think he'll be the main guy at either of those teams like he is at Crystal Palace. They've got a lot of other good players as well, and although he'll play a lot of minutes, I'm sure, for both those teams, I do think there'll be a slight adjustment period. And for someone priced at 10 million, I want a bit more of a sure thing going into the season. Uh, Maybe once the transfer window closes and you get a bit more surety of where he's going to play next year or what role he's going to be playing, then I think Eze is going to be a really good pick for the rest of the season. All right, so that was a few midfielders there. Let's have a look at the forwards now. Now, unsurprisingly, the highest owned forwards here are Haaland and Salah. Now, I have seen a few teams with both of these players in their team, but I do think it does limit the rest of your team if you do pick both of them. You're spending almost 27 million of your 100 million budget on just two players. So that's over a quarter of your budget gone just like that. So I do think it's probably more optimal to just pick one of these two to start the season with if you do want them, and have a look at things like captaincy and fixtures to help you decide which one of these two players you prefer. Salah is obviously 4 million more than Haaland, but I do think he offers more avenues to points based on mainly his creative numbers being a lot better than Haaland's. Haaland might score more goals, but Salah will pick up a lot more different kinds of points throughout the season, which probably will result in him having a higher average to end the season. Now, just below the two big guys, we've got Florian Wirtz here. I think his price is very reasonable given what he can offer. I don't think he'll get anywhere near the same number of goals as a Haaland or a Salah, but I do think he'll probably come close to topping the league in assists, and he'll get a lot of defensive points along the way as well, because he's very hardworking off the ball. And just having a look at Liverpool's preseason friendlies so far, it does look like he does come and help the centre mids when defending, but then sprint forward and join the attack when Liverpool's attacking. So he does offer a bit of best of both worlds in that situation. Now, obviously as a forward, he won't be getting any clean sheet points or anything like that, but he'll still pick up points for CBIT, and he'll definitely pick up a lot of points for things such as key passes, shots on target, successful dribbles, etc. So Wirtz is slowly becoming a lock in my team, especially if I decide to go without Salah, because I do want at least one Liverpool attacker in there, given that they're comfortably the best attack in the league, and I do expect them to score the most goals in the league as well. So having at least one attacker from them does make sense, and Wirtz is probably going to be the guy that I end up starting the season with. Now, going down, Højlund is owned by 18% of you, which will need to change because Man United have just signed Sesko, who is going to be their starting striker going forward. Højlund isn't guaranteed a starting spot, and he might not even be guaranteed as their backup striker because there are rumours that United are looking to sell him. So I would definitely get off the Højlund pick and try and find a different striker there. João Pedro, as we mentioned before, he's had an amazing preseason with Chelsea so far. His minutes will be shared a little bit with someone like Liam Delap, but he can play a variety of positions across the front line. So even if he's not starting as striker, you might see him start on the left wing and cut inside, or start as a second striker just behind someone like a Delap, with Cole Palmer possibly starting on the right wing. So there's a few different ways that Chelsea can play. But obviously when it comes to Supercoach, you would rather have him just playing up front every single game, just banging in goals. But it does look like he might rotate around a bit in this Chelsea team. Speaking of just playing up front and banging in goals though, the next two strikers here in Watkins and Gyökeres should offer exactly that. They're both the starting strikers for their respective teams, and I expect them to get a lot of points across the season. Can't really go wrong with either of these guys. There might be a slight adjustment period, of course, for Gyökeres having come into a new team, but with the amount of chances that Arsenal tend to create, I do think he's almost the perfect kind of striker for them, and I think he can definitely hit the ground running. Now, just below that, we do have Bukayo Saka, who I think is pretty low owned here at 7%, to be honest. I would have thought that he'd be higher owned. Maybe he's just a bit of a forgotten man here, given that, Gyökeres is a new signing, and Saka doesn't really have the highest points total from last year, but again, that is because he was injured for a few games, so he did miss quite a big chunk of the season. If you do convert his average over the course of a whole season, he does become one of the highest point scorers in the league. And as we saw in the stats earlier for the forwards, Saka does actually have one of the highest expected Supercoach points per game, just because he offers so many different avenues to scoring. Not only is he good with the goals and assists, which is what you'd expect for a forward, he contributes a lot in the creative aspect of the game, and he's not bad with the defensive aspect of the game either for a forward, and all those points add up. So I'm definitely interested in Saka to start the season if I can find the money for him, but there's a lot of good players I want, so we'll see how many of them I can fit in. Isak, as we mentioned earlier, I would definitely avoid for now until his situation becomes a bit clearer. And to just finish up, we'll just discuss some of these cheaper forwards here, like Mark Guiu at Sunderland, Igor Thiago at Brentford, and Fulkrug at West Ham. Although these players are very cheap and it does give you a lot more budget to spend in other positions on your team, I would argue that the forwards are probably the most important position to get right in your Supercoach team, given the quality of players that we have available and that we can only actually select 3 of them. There's way too many good players here that I want, and I have no idea how I'm going to narrow that down to just 3. So that does mean that I will need to probably go a bit cheaper in the other positions, but from the research and the stats that we've looked at across the last couple of videos, what we found is that there are quite a few cheaper players available in these positions that still offer quite a good avenue to points. Players like Jack Grealish or even a Kiernan Dewsbury Hall here seem to be offering a lot more value for their price point than what you could get for the same price in the forward line. So that's why I think I'm going to go a bit heavier in my forward line and try and find a bit more value in my defense and my midfield. But I'll leave it there for now, I think. This has already been going on for way too long. Thank you so much for joining me in having a look at the best midfielders and forwards going into the Supercoach EPL season. That concludes my series where I've also looked at the best goalkeepers and the best defenders in my last video. If you haven't checked that out already, please feel free to do so. I've also created a couple of Supercoach leagues for any of you to join if you're interested. The league codes are below. There's an open league and a head-to-head league for whatever interests you. Thank you again for joining me on this journey into the new Supercoach EPL format, and I hope you're all enjoying the content on this channel. I really appreciate all of your support. Let's all have a great Supercoach season. I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.